Great, awesome. Good evening, everyone. Assalamu alaikum. My name is Darakshan Raja. I am the co-director of Justice for Muslims Collective. We are a grassroots organization based in DC that works to tackle Islamophobia. I'm really, really excited to co-organize and be part of this beautiful teach-in that is going to be talking about particularly the ways in which the Joint Terrorism Task Force is being used to repress dissent. I'm joined by an incredible star lineup of leaders in the movement who are fighting against surveillance. And just to do a very quick kind of context setting of why we decided to do this teach-in, we know that we are currently in a moment of a powerful uprising that is happening across the world, including in this country, really sort of launched by the murder of George Floyd. And since then, we've had millions of people across the world show up in protest, but in particular in the US. And we've also seen the horrible arm of the militarized state respond. We've seen the National Guard show up. We've had militarized weapons, drones, all of that technology and that apparatus being used against protesters who are demanding justice, dignity, and freedom in particular. And so as part of that, what we wanted to do in this teach-in is to talk about, as part of the Trump administration, we've seen over 10,000 protesters who've been arrested. We know that protesters have also been killed as a result of going out there. And one of the things that came out of the administration was that they would be using this apparatus called the JTTF, the Joint Terrorism Task Force, to go after protesters. And so we know that currently there are 500 open investigations. And so we wanted to do this teach-in, one, for our community, for folks who are organizers, who are activists, and we wanted to connected to the broader history of repression of movements by the state, surveillance, and also feature incredible organizers who are pushing back against that apparatus in particular, and some success stories of local areas in the country that have been able to successfully get their localities out of the JTTF in particular. So that's what we are doing today. We're definitely live streaming this webinar and this teach-in. We will be having our backup team, Celine and others, who are going to be looking at the chat for any of your questions. So please definitely engage with us. And so with that, I want to turn it over to our first incredible speaker, Mayasia, who is with Media Justice. And so Mayasia, if you want to take it over, that would be great.
Awesome. Hi, everyone. It's good to be here. Thank you so much for inviting me to participate and join in on this teach-in today. I'm the campaign director at an organization called Media Justice. Media Justice is a national organization that's based in Oakland, California, and our mission is to fight for the communication and digital rights of communities of color in order for us to achieve a future in which we are all represented, connected, and free. And as a movement-centered, Black and Brown-led organization, it's been really important for us to understand the unique impacts and threats that are facing our communities today. We live in a world in which our media and technology environment, on one hand, has been really essential in telling our story. When we're in control of our media and our, internet, we get the right to share our story and talk about the lived experiences and expose the truth about how racism, capitalism, patriarchy, imperialism has actually shaped our lives. But on the other hand of things, right, we also know that our media and technology spaces have not been neutral actors, and in fact, have actually played a role to undermine and at times been really complicit in state-sanctioned violence against communities of color. So for instance, companies like Amazon and Microsoft and IBM sell really harmful and dangerous surveillance tools to law enforcement at all levels, including things like facial recognition, which has been proven to be inaccurate and racially biased, putting our communities at further risk of criminalization and violence by the state. And I think it's important, I wanted to share a little bit of that context about how we came to this work, but I also wanted to name that because we're seeing an investment in surveillance because we're seeing this sort of investment in surveillance because surveillance is actually a core part of policing. In fact, surveillance actually really dates back even further beyond the conversations that we normally have when we talk about surveillance. Surveillance is a really core part of policing. And that's why it's a very profitable business today. There's actually a book called Dark Matters by Simone Brown, who argues that the current models that we see for surveillance today actually dates back to the 1800s, when Black and Indigenous folks were required to carry lanterns to make themselves visible at night. Not being able to exist freely in public was important for maintaining slavery, and this idea that there needed to be some sort of social control because Black and Brown people were inherently a threat. And manufacturing that threat, labeling us as a threat to the United States or dangerous, has continued since then. And I know this in a really personal way because part of the reason why I got into activist work is truthfully because of my family. My grandfather was a member of the Black Panther Party, and my godmother was a member of the Students for a Democratic Society, which were organizations or political organizations in the 50s and 60s that were heavily surveilled by local law enforcement and the FBI. And while people at the time clearly knew that they were being watched and surveilled, I think what people kind of misunderstood or didn't quite know yet was to the extent of that surveillance, how the government was keeping all sorts of records about their affiliations, who they were connected to, where they lived, where they went to school, where they worked. Later on, my godmother found out that the government has 60,000 FBI files on her because of her activist work from SDS and then later, the Weather Underground. Part of the reason why I think it's important to name that is because when the Citizens Committee broke into the FBI office in Media, Pennsylvania, they were able to confirm the fact that the FBI and local law enforcement were watching activists that were part of the movement at the time. However, what they didn't know at the time was to the extent that they were actually really developing or actually gathering this information to not just watch their activities, but actually to undermine the organizing work. The FBI and local law enforcement would create misinformation, would create rumors, plant false information about different organizations in the media. They would regularly tap people's phones, even at universities and colleges around the country. And they regularly actually collaborated with local law enforcement in big major cities like Chicago, LA, New York, so forth and so on. And at the very worst, we know that they were also responsible for murdering a lot of civil rights leaders, including Fred Hampton, who was literally gunned down in his sleep while sleeping next to his partner. When COINTEL was exposed, it confirmed the fact that the FBI had a vested interest in exposing, discrediting, misdirecting, and neutralizing, in their own words, the movement of the 1950s and 60s, because they saw the demands and the organizing work as a direct threat to the agenda of the United States. And this is also when I think it's important to name that this is also when we see the militarization of the police. So if you actually study the history of SWAT teams, right? SWAT teams were created in response to the Watts riots. And from there, they were able to say, we need this arm and this division of our law enforcement to respond to the race rebellions and respond to, quote unquote, agitated Negroes and so forth and so on. And so this is when you also see this sort of funneling of militarized equipment down to local law enforcement to respond to protesters in moments of rebellion and unrest. So this is a background that's in a history that I think is really important because everything that we're seeing now is a continuation of what we've already been experiencing in our communities. Even a couple of years ago, in 2017, Foreign Policy leaked an FBI document that said the FBI had created a new designation called Black Identity Extremists because of they believed a pattern of extremism growing within the Black community. They actually had connected 6 isolated incidents where Black folks did commit violence against cops as an indication that there was this growing movement of violence towards police officers, even though none of these individuals were part of any BLM chapter, even though these individuals were not connected to any Black-led movement organization, even though the movement itself has not ever been responsible for any acts of violence. But still, they connected those isolated incidents, and they actually cited the uprisings in response to Mike Brown's shooting death as a further indication that the perception of racism and police brutality makes Black people a threat. And this is very similar to how J. Edgar Hoover, who was managing COINTELPRO, talked about the Panthers. The Panthers were considered a threat to the security of the United States of America because of their perspectives and ideas about police brutality and racism in this country. Since then, when we found out about the Black Identity Extremist designation, we were immediately alarmed because, as I said, Media Justice is an organization that is connected to community. We're fighting alongside with Black and Brown people all around the country. And so we know from our own experiences, from our own lived histories, that they're talking about us, they're talking about our people. And so we immediately filed a FOIA request to understand the scope of this surveillance, to understand who exactly are they looking for, because again, some of the ways in which the mechanisms that they're able to do this is hiding their activities as in secrecy and not being transparent. And so once we filed the FOIA request, they had a certain amount of time to respond to it, and surprise, surprise, they actually didn't. And so from there, we filed a lawsuit demanding documents that, demanding responsive documents about Black identity extremism, and then later racially motivated extremism, because another tactic is to evolve the terminology so that we're going on this chase to figure out what exactly they're doing. Interestingly enough, when we finally did receive documents from our litigation, the very first set of responsive documents had JTTF all over our documents. They were having, there were corresponding emails talking about having meetings to discuss Black identity extremism, because this was an intelligence assessment that was disseminated to every single local law enforcement agency around the country. And so we know that partnerships at all levels continue to happen, and that the JTTF is still very involved in helping the FBI and local law enforcement surveil and track and monitor protesters. So yeah, it continues today. And I'll wrap it up because I think I'm out of time.
Thank you so much, Maisha, for that. That was incredible. And thank you for doing such a great job in overlaying the history of it and also landing us to the JTTF piece. So with that, I want to hand it over to Sue to talk about what is the JTTF and how does it work, and how many JTTFs do we have across the country right now? So Sue, if you could share your wisdom and knowledge with us, that would be great.
Thanks, Darakshan. And thank you so much, Maisha. I think that Maisha made it pretty clear that surveillance and the FBI operates in this country to uphold white supremacy and capitalism and undermine any movement that challenges that. It always has and it always will. As Maisha pointed out, that throughout the agency's history, we've seen them blatantly target Blacks, Muslims, immigrants, Indigenous people, and dissidents. And the reason why the FBI can do this is because they operate under their own special rules. It's really important, I think, to understand that unlike most police agencies, the FBI can launch an invasive investigation without having even any suspicion that you have committed a crime or are about to commit a crime. And an agent can open an investigation based in part on a person's race, religion, or other First Amendment activity. So yeah, with no suspicion, but based in part on an agent's bias or racism, the agent is allowed to do physical surveillance. They're allowed to search vast commercial and government databases, conduct overt and covert interviews. And by that, I mean the FBI can knock on your door and say they're an agent, or they can say that they're your new neighbor. They can also show up at your work. They can question your mom, your best friend, and they can do or your boss. They can also do racial and ethnic mapping of your neighborhood. They can recruit and task informants to infiltrate your group. And they can also dig through your trash. So we know that the FBI is bad, that they have awesome authorities, but what are the FBI's Joint Terrorism Task Forces and what do they do? So I would say that the JTTF is really a force multiplier for the FBI. It brings together state and local police with federal agencies under the umbrella of the FBI. So that it can include ICE, it can include the Drug Enforcement Administration, any other federal agency. Joint Terrorism Task Forces can also include the military and private industry. So the first JTTF was established in New York City in 1980. And today there are about 200 task forces around the country, including at least one in each of the FBI's 56 field offices, and over 600 state, local, and federal agencies participate in these task forces. So they're huge. Members of JTTFs play by the FBI rules, and they have at their disposal the vast resources and databases of the FBI. So the arrangement also amps up the power of local cops, right? It expands also the web of information sharing, including the trash that comes out of fusion centers, which the FBI holds on to for longer even than the fusion centers themselves hold on to, no matter if it's inaccurate or outdated. Moreover, the FBI exercises these incredible powers in nearly complete secrecy. Local cops are often not even allowed to let their supervisors know what they're up to, obviously preventing oversight. So as Darakshan noted at the beginning, when we came together, that Attorney General Barr has repeatedly said that these Joint Terrorism Task Forces would be the primary tool the administration would use to go against these so-called riots. And last week, he said that the FBI has launched more than 500 investigations targeting hardcore instigators. So I think it would be helpful to just get a quick overview of the types of things that Joint Terrorism Task Forces have done in the past so that we know what we're looking at. So the thing that I find the most horrendous that the FBI and their Joint Terrorism Task Forces do is that they undertake sting operations in order to create the perception that certain movements or people are dangerous. Most of us would recognize these sting operations as entrapment, where a paid informant lures usually young people into fake terrorist plots devised by the informant and where the informant provides the impetus, resources, and contacts to carry out the plot. This has been used hundreds and hundreds of times since 9/11 against Muslims, but it's also been used to try to bring down movements. So one example I just really quickly want to give is what happened in Occupy Cleveland, where a paid FBI informant infiltrated the Occupy camp and befriended a group of young men who were passionate about the cause, but really kind of living on the edge without resources, family support, or jobs. So this guy, this informant, befriended them. He was very generous with them and acted as kind of a father figure, and he reeled them in, egging them on to engage in violence. He purchased explosives, he gave them money, he helped, he made connections for them, and he helped them to plant these supposed bombs that he had provided at the base of a bridge. So of course the FBI swept in, they exposed this terror plot that they created on their own. I mean, and this was on the eve of May Day, just as Occupy Cleveland was planning a major action to kind of rejuvenate the movement after the winter. But the news of the fake terror plot pretty much wiped out Occupy Cleveland. So in addition to things like entrapment, we've seen Joint Terrorism Task Forces try to get try to get people to become informants. In 2010 and 2011 in Springfield, Massachusetts, the Joint Terrorism Task Force agents relentlessly pursued Ayub Abdul Alim, an African-American Muslim, to become an informant and spy on his Muslim community. He refused, even after he was arrested on weapons charges. He says that the gun was planted on him and he was put in jail. At his trial, he discovered that the JTTF had recruited his wife to become an informant. They're just vicious and evil. In 2011, 2012, even before the first activists even arrived at Zuccotti Park, the FBI was spying on Occupy Wall Street and monitoring infiltration. Most of the Occupy encampments from Jacksonville to Florida to Anchorage, Alaska. In 2012, 2014, as the protests against the Keystone Pipeline were really building, the FBI and its Joint Terrorism Task Force spied on pipeline opponents in Houston, Oklahoma, and Nebraska. And they also colluded with TransCanada, which is the company that was building the pipeline, to crack down on protesters. We know, as Maisha said, starting in 2014, as the movement for Black Lives was growing, the JTTFs were there, planting confidential informants in movements across the country. And so just to let you know how creepy the Joint Terrorism Task Forces are, excuse me, as recently as 2018, the North Carolina Joint Terrorism Task Force employed Chris Baker. He is the imperial wizard of the loyal white knights of the Ku Klux Klan. They employ him as a paid informant. His handlers are 2 Greensboro Police Department Intelligence Unit officers. And a bit of history here, in 1979, the Greensboro Police Department had a paid informant that led a KKK neo-Nazi march into a Black housing project where they shot and killed 5 residents. So the informant did nothing to save the community. He just helped the KKK. We know that the FBI has pulled strings to keep Baker out of jail, despite numerous probation violations and weapons and assault charges. We also know in 2016, 2017, the FBI paid at least 1 informant to infiltrate the Standing Rock encampment. The one we know about is Heath Harmon. He ended up in a romantic relationship with Red Fawn Fallis. He brought his gun into the encampment, and somehow that gun went off when police tackled Red Fawn. Police claim she fired it, and she's serving 5 years in prison right now. We know the JTTFs also coordinated with private security companies in their surveillance of Standing Rock, and that JTTF agents questioned water protectors around the country. And right now, we know that JTTFs are questioning activists who have been engaged in the protests, and we know that FBI agents are also questioning people who've been arrested. And just one quick word right now, although we might go into this more later, about FBI interviews and when the FBI questions you. It's important to know that it's a felony to lie to an FBI agent, even if you aren't under oath. Again, it's not like lying to a cop, which you're allowed to do unless you're under oath. So we know that the FBI is dangerous to movements, and we know that Congress has been unwilling to challenge the FBI, but we can challenge the FBI, and one pressure point is to force our local police to withdraw from the Joint Terrorism Task Forces, and that could undermine the FBI. And that's all I have to say about Joint Terrorism Task Forces, Darakshan.
Wow, Sue, thank you so much. That was so informative and enraging, and thank you for naming all of these different particular cases. Yeah, thank you for that, Sue. So staying in the same vein of the terrible FBI and the JTTF, I wanted to hand it over to Fatima from the Muslim Justice League. She directs that incredible organization. Thank you so much for being here.
Hi all, thank you so much for having me on this incredible teach-in. I love working with everyone on this teach-in, and I'm really glad that we're having this conversation because I know, with our organizing here in Massachusetts, that a lot of folks have been wondering, what does this actually look like day to day? What will it look like if the JTTF shows up at my door? And so I really want to share, from our knowledge working with, predominantly Muslim folks. It's definitely not just Muslims who are targeted daily, but majority of the folks targeted, day to day by the JTTF are Muslim folks. And you just heard some of the cases that Sue brought up, but I want to dig a little bit deeper into what that typically looks like. So, as Maisha talked about, the FBI has this really long history of surveilling communities, and it's not just activists who get targeted. I think we often, notice and talk about activists getting targeted, which is really, really awful. But it's also just communities getting targeted in a way that suppresses community organizing from even starting. And so you see that, throughout the history of the FBI, at least going back to the 1930s, they saw Black Muslims advocating for racial justice and said that they were fanatics of racial equality. And then they proceeded to surveil all Black and brown Muslims at the time. And now what this looks like today is them showing up at people's houses or your place of work. So those are kind of the two typical places that they might show up and try to catch you off guard. What that looks like for Muslims is, it's not just about getting people to become informants, although that is definitely one of the major tactics that we've seen. And it's not just about these entrapment cases, which is, again, another major tactic that we've seen. Sometimes it's really about triangulating to get information about people and really targeting you at your vulnerabilities. So some examples of vulnerabilities that the FBI might exploit by talking to multiple people and trying to figure out, information about somebody else is, if someone is queer and has not come out publicly. If you have an undocumented family member or, someone who you're in close relationship with who is undocumented. If you have, prior charges or convictions. Or if you're in public housing, really any kind of precarious situation that you or other people are in, they know how to get that information out of folks. And then they can use that, right, to really pressure people to become informants, or they just have these conversations where they're getting information out of you and they're telling you that, they might tell you, we know that you're a good community member and we're just checking in with you. But what you don't realize is they're gathering information about you and they're gathering information about other people as well. How this functions and what this essentially does is it creates a lot of fear and stigma within the community, right? And a lot of discord because you don't know who's been talking to the FBI. You don't know how they've gotten this information about you when they do show up. And it's really, really hard to say no or to shut your door in the moment when they show up. And so I highly recommend that folks, anybody who is watching this, watch some of the Know Your Rights videos that are out there and practice and really think about what happens when somebody knocks on your door and says that they're with the FBI. The other thing to know, and this is a big problem for Boston because we have so many universities, any law enforcement officers can participate in the JTTF. So there are campus police who are part of the Joint Terrorism Task Force, the Boston Police Department, Cambridge Police Department, all of these different law enforcement officers can be part of it. And that allows them to act as an FBI agent. And so you might think that they are showing up in a very different capacity and not realize that they're part of the Joint Terrorism Task Force. And so again, this really, I think suppresses our ability to organize with each other and to speak freely, because for Muslims, this isn't just, activists that have it happening. I think many of us have either had this happen to ourselves or have had it happen to, close family members or friends who are not organizers, who are not publicly out there. It's actually, some of us who are really public, like myself, are protected a little bit, right? It's going to be obvious if the FBI shows up at my door that I know what to do and that I have a bunch of attorneys to back me up. But it's very different if they show up at my parents' house or a friend's house or an undocumented person who is a member of Muslim Justice League, right? So we have to be thinking not just about ourselves, but how do we make sure, everyone in our community, particularly those who are incredibly vulnerable, know, what to do in those moments. And I want to say that, we're not just talking about, surveillance as like this tech-centered thing, right? We're talking about infiltrating people's lives, right? And that is so harmful and it's so violent. But the JTTF has also gone beyond that. Here in Boston, almost exactly 5 years ago in 2015, they murdered a young Black Muslim man, Osama Rahim. He was only 26 years old, and multiple agents, descended upon him in a public parking lot and killed him. And they are able to use, this justification of national security and counterterrorism and setting people up to be able to do so much harm to folks day to day, particularly, young Black Muslim folks. I think, are so impacted so heavily by this. And so I really want to uplift what happened to Osama Rahim, which, it's not every day that they're doing that, but it can result in that kind of violence. But every day it is a violent suppression, of our ability to speak out for our rights. Thank you.
Wow, thank you so much for that. Yeah, and we'll definitely get to questions. I see some questions are coming in. We'll definitely get it to after our speakers are done. And so with that, I want to turn it over to Javeria and Summer to talk a little bit about how they organized successfully to get the Bay Area to get out of the JTTF. I know I'm pretty upset and enraged, and I know DC definitely participates in the JTTF. Let us know what can we do to organize?
Sure. Thank you so much, Fatma and Sue, for giving us kind of the context of why the JTTF and the FBI's history with our communities has been so problematic. What I'm going to do is talk a little bit about a case study in terms of San Francisco and what happened around 2010 to 2012. So bear with me. It was a 2-year campaign that a number of civil rights organizations really invested resources and time into, as well as grassroots community organizing groups and clients that were directly impacted. And we all worked together under a banner called the Coalition for Safe San Francisco. So I'm gonna try and get through a lot of information fairly fast. And if there's anything I missed, hopefully we can address it in the Q&A section. So I'm gonna go ahead and share my screen and you guys can let me know if you can see it okay. So let me start from the beginning. Okay, are you guys seeing it? Okay. So the Coalition for Safe San Francisco started in 2010. It was a response to actually the police chief in San Fran, George Gascon at the time, who was at it was like an earthquake bond effort, and there was a brunch where there were over 150 city officials, and he was trying to advocate for the bond and talk about why they were moving, they wanted the bond to pass, and they wanted to move some of the SFPD police functions outside of the Hall of Justice and into a newer building. And the way he went about that was by trying to say that the building wasn't susceptible to just an earthquake, but it was susceptible to members of the Middle Eastern community parking a van in front of it and blowing it up. This caused a shockwave throughout the community. For those of you that are familiar with the San Francisco Bay Area, it has a large Arab American Muslim demographic. And at first he tried to backtrack from these comments by saying he wasn't actually talking about Arab Americans, he was talking about specifically Yemenis and Afghans, as if that was making the comment or profiling any better. But it was insightful in terms of even looking at our community is very diverse in terms of what we phrase as AMEMSA, Arab, Middle Eastern, Muslim, South Asian. There's a lot of differences in terms of power, access, when different communities immigrated. The Arab American community in San Francisco is pretty affluent. You get a lot of heat if you kind of go after that community a little bit more than if you were to target, say, a newer immigrant community like the Yemeni American community. And what I found as a community organizer in the San Francisco Bay Area for over 10 years is that sometimes our government takes advantage of that, and they think if they can get away with singling even segments within our community. As we saw after 9/11, Muslim men were predominantly demonized as a threat. In much the same way you see in the Black community, young Black men are criminalized. And there's a history of doing that and trying to use divide and conquer tactics among communities of struggle. So the impact was that the story was on the front page of all the newspapers. It was probably one of the few times where I saw a very visceral, almost like a scream from the community, where people were, as an organizer, you kind of know, you identify it as a moment where you can really make impact. We had been organizing around profiling at airports with FBI, with police for a number of years. But I think this was the first time where we had almost unanimous kind of like uprising from organizations, leaderships across the spectrum that this wasn't acceptable. We had almost an immediate rise in youth bullying actually in schools where kids were being called terrorists. The police chief's comments were had a wide reach, and it led to the formation of the coalition as an ad hoc committee. And then as we kind of uncovered more information, we became a more permanent structure that began working on community organizing, legal advocacy, and policy work in tandem. So in light of the statements, the positive thing was that the community had had enough. It was kind of like the George Floyd incident where it was maybe the straw that broke the camel's back, and people rose up and said, there's gonna be accountability at this juncture. So he had to actually give a public apology at a Friday prayer where we had thousands of members attend. And it was interesting, I was able to go. I think there was a sentiment of maybe the community finally feeling like they were being humanized, and that the dignity that was being stripped of them and all these policies that happened after 9/11 was finally being addressed. So to kind of quickly give you guys an overview of this 2-year campaign, the police chief's remarks were made in 2010. He made an apology. He was pressured to make the apology within almost a month afterwards, and then that sparked a community organizing and education campaign until we introduced the CSSF Civil Rights Ordinance in January 2012. And then we had about half a year of struggle to actually get it signed by the mayor and enacted into law. One thing that we learned in San Francisco, kind of to go back to Sue and Fatma's points, is the FBI's history in terms of intelligence abuses is fairly known. COINTELPRO and a number of incidents that are documented well kind of associate, especially the FBI's role in civil rights abuses in terms of why that department is problematic. What's probably not as known is that how intelligence units within police departments operate. And San Francisco in particular has a very ugly history that I'll go into in a minute. But what had happened here was there was actually a secret MOU between the city of San Francisco and the FBI that was enacted in 2007. And it was the first time that the FBI came up with this argument that the MOU is actually the property of the FBI. So they couldn't release it under like normal public records act requests. And the police department also kind of echoed that statement as to why they were not able to comply with the California Public Records Act requests that ACLU and Asian Law Caucus at the time had been working on. And the MOU, of course, is controlled by the Attorney General guidelines, where we had been increasingly concerned and protesting about the loosening of the guidelines and how they effectively allow infiltration of lawful organizations. They allow surveillance of Muslim communities. They allow these interviews without articulable suspicion of criminal activity. So it was a dragnet approach to intimidating the community and harassing individuals. So going to San Francisco's specific history, SFPD's intelligence unit had actually been documented to have spied on everything from the Democratic National Convention to civil groups, labor groups. There was even undercover surveillance against activists that were working on human rights issues in El Salvador and Central America. In 1993, there was an officer, Tom Girard, who was also spying, and he was caught with selling information to an operative for the Anti-Defamation League, Roy Bullock. And these were on pro-Palestinian activists, anti-apartheid groups, and he was giving information to them like apartheid South Africa and Israel, where residents in San Francisco, when they were trying to travel, for example, back home, they were facing issues, and it was clear that this information had been shared. These abuses led to a very strong outcry and development of Department General Order 8.10, which is effectively local intelligence guidelines that were meant to protect against such similar abuses moving forward. At the time, elected officials and the police chief also, they made the statements that the police department is not the CIA, and that they had to rein the department back in under civilian oversight. So when it came back to harnessing kind of the community's response to this one statement, it kind of opened the floodgates to the broader question of post 9/11 surveillance and profiling. There had been a number of kind of, I would say, grievances from the community that we were trying to formulate into a structured campaign to make a dent on the root causes of the problem. So what we kind of did an analysis within the coalition on what exactly the infrastructure that was targeting the community looked like. And what we found was that the information really did flow up. So when you have a local law enforcement agency that has a trusted relationship with the community, such as the SFPD, and local officers are then deputized to act under the rules of the FBI, and we lose the visibility and the civilian oversight, that's where we wanted to start pushing back. And to understand why that's important, although the history of SFPD is ugly, as well as the FBI in the region, kind of the positive aspect of that is it did help shape the SFPD guidelines and local and state protections to be some of the strongest safeguards in the country. So in California, the state constitution guarantees an inalienable right of privacy. It bans intrusive surveillance. Local policies include DGO 8.10, which I mentioned, which requires reasonable suspicion of serious criminal activity and written authorization if the SFPD begins getting involved in intelligence gathering around First Amendment activity. We also have DGO 5.17, which has broader protections against biased policing practices than the weaker FBI standards. SF is also known to be a city of refuge, where SFPD is prohibited from working with federal immigration enforcement. And then our charter requires SFPD to be subject to local civilian control and oversight. So after having many meetings with the community and kind of strategizing, we realized that the first step was that the community needed to be heard. What had been happening to individuals, there's a lot of shame of being visited by the FBI, for example. If you're an engineer at Google, for example, that's probably not what you want to advertise your friends, family. Sometimes there's shame around being contacted by law enforcement. So we wanted to provide a space where it was safe for people to speak out, where we could see visibility across the community on how we were impacted. And we decided that this is really a basic human rights issue. So we partnered with the SF Human Rights Commission to hold the first of its kind hearing in September of 2011, where people that were directly impacted and our clients gave testimony publicly for the first time about being harassed by the FBI or SFPD, FBI JTTF officers at the border and how that impacted them. We did a large call for stories, and we actually did a marketing campaign where we had visuals for people and we explained how people can document their story. We translated it in various languages. We used some familiar faces to help kind of overcome some of the fear barriers that were in the community at the time. And it was one of the most well-attended Human Rights Commission hearings in their history. We also had people outside the AMEMSA community that were often subject to some of the same ignorant practices. For example, we had one of the more powerful testimonies came from a young student from the Sikh community who talked about being pulled aside every time he traveled and put in a cage and harassed, and how that made him feel. And we really dug into kind of the different mental and implications that the community faced because of this treatment. We also had an approach where we wanted to focus on education and how to safeguard the community, like what your rights are if the FBI comes to visit you, that you have the right to remain silent. FBI interactions and JTTF interactions can be some of the most frightening, but you really have a powerful tool to just remain silent, ask for the agent's business card and tell them that your attorney will be speaking to them on your behalf. Our other panelists kind of talked a little bit about what the JTTF is. What mattered for us in San Francisco was really that the MOU sets the terms of the relationship with the FBI. And since the FBI was abiding by guidelines that were harming our community, while our local police had some of the best safeguards when it came to interfacing with our community, we wanted to make sure that our local protections prevailed. So that was the impetus behind really pursuing getting a resolution on file. At that time, it was, we were discussing whether we should completely opt out and fight for that campaign, which would have been more difficult because of the national security framing, or to pursue a resolution, or to take the police chief's word that he was basically mandating that his officers stick to local standards without that being in writing. So that wasn't going to be acceptable for us. At the end of the campaign, we effectively went with the ordinance, and Supervisor Jane Kim helped to sponsor it. We used the year of organizing to continue to build a record of community testimony and basically help to empower the community to show up to rallies, to speak to their elected officials, to implement any ideas that they had with community education spaces and events. And in 2012, Mayor Edley helped sign the ordinance into law. we knew at that point that that was just also the beginning, not the end. And it was never kind of the goal for us to simply just pass a law, because we know that the process of the community standing up for their rights and speaking out is almost just as important as the outcome of the legislation. So for us, there have been, since 2001, a deliberate dehumanization of the Muslim community and using the specter of security and fear. So even the name of the Coalition for a Safe San Francisco, was meant to take that back and bring respect, dignity, and humanization to the community, and to empower them to tell the true story of what was happening and the abuses there. In the first report that was mandated by the legislation in 2013 was horrible. It was literally a 2-minute oral presentation from the police commission. And that in and of itself caused outrage in the community, and we fear the department was not taking the ordinance seriously. So SFPD was forced to present a report in written form, and we kept pushing and pushing, and it was the same coalition, the same clients, community organizers, and by the third report, it was actually a substantive report that went into what the SFPD officers were doing. And it talked about what kind of tasks that they do, what their command structure is, what's their salary, and it gave us visibility into if they were being used by the FBI as a force multiplier for racial and religious profiling. I'm going to hand it over to Javeria to talk a little bit about what's happened since then. But in terms of the model, it's now been employed statewide through AB 2598, which by member Rob Bonta, and Karen, our coalition partners, were working very closely to try and get this passed this year. Unfortunately, because of COVID-19, the bill is no longer in play at the moment. However, it received high consideration from a number of officials we talked to, and it kind of underscores why statewide coalition and grassroots efforts to actually speak up and push back about these issues are so important. Even 10 years later, we're seeing that the issue is still relevant. It's perhaps more important than ever for allied struggles that we keep pushing on this issue. And maybe with that, Javeria, I'll pass it over to you.
Thanks, Summer, for that, and I love the cat picture. Thanks for that at the end too. Yeah, I know that we're almost at time, so I'm going to quickly just talk about what happened between 2013 and 2017, which is when SFPD finally withdrew from the JTTF participation. So basically, as Summer said, in 2012, we passed this ordinance that required SFPD officers who were going to participate in the JTTF to follow local and state laws and not the FBI standards, right? And part of the law, and to make sure that there was transparency and oversight, and the SFPD was in fact doing what the ordinance was asking them to do, the ordinance required SFPD to submit an annual report before the police commission. It was a public hearing where, obviously like Asian Law Caucus, CARE, ACLU, and community members would go in and see what the report was, and had the opportunity to give public comment as well, right? So there was a really long period, I would say, between, so what our approach then, I would say between those 5 years was monitoring for compliance / non-compliance, right? So one spectrum or one end of the compliance monitoring was showing up at these police commission hearings and looking through these reports that SFPD was submitting and seeing what they were saying, right? And then the other prong of the compliance, right, was or to monitoring compliance was actually going out in the community, which is where your organizers and community advocates come in, and seeing whether the community was being harassed by SFPD participating in the JTTF or not, right? And so in 2014 is when we actually did find non-compliance on part of SFPD with the ordinance itself, right? So a San Francisco police officer working as part of the JTTF showed up to a Muslim Pakistani man's like place of employment, and started asking him questions about his travels to Pakistan, about his like religious and political views, things that like under the ordinance and under San Francisco laws, the SFPD officer shouldn't have been asking, right? And at the same time, when it was time for SFPD to submit their 2014 report in 2015, right? Because the report would come a year after, there was no mention of like this incident, right? And so what Karen ALC did was we filed a complaint with the Office of Citizen Complaints, and it took, I would say, about 2 years for OCC to make its do its investigation and finally make a finding of non-compliance, right? And basically what OCC said was that the SFPD officer did not comply with the ordinance, and it's largely a result of training failures at the hands of the SFPD, right? So then between 2016 and 2017 began this work of like talking with the San Francisco Police Department, going back and forth and trying to pressure them into changing their, their training manuals, like trying to work with them in updating that and making sure that the officers were following local and state law. We were still having those conversations, right? We were still having those conversations when a few different things happened that finally resulted in SFPD withdrawing, right? So one was Trump got elected. And then the second piece was that by operation of local law, right, the MOU that SFPD had with JTTF was going to expire, right? And for them to, so just to back up a little bit, the MOUs that police departments sign with the FBI around the JTTF actually have no expiration date, right? So they can go into perpetuity. The only like stopgap on that is if your locality has some sort of ordinance or requirement that the MOUs have to be reviewed by the city council every so often or whatever. So in San Francisco, there's a law that says any MOU that goes beyond 10 years has to come back to city council at the end of those 10 years for like consideration and approval before the partnership can continue, right? So in 2017 is when SFPD had to bring the MOU back in front of city council. But by that point, like there had been a lot of community pressure. There had been a lot of like advocacy done by our organizations and the community around like the non-compliance issues, right? And like that the fact that SFPD was violating local law. Donald Trump had become president. He had like explicitly as a presidential candidate used anti-Muslim rhetoric. And so there was a lot of like, I would say the stars just lined up in like, the stars just lined up perfectly. And then there was a new police chief in San Francisco at that time too. And rather than like having to address all the non-compliance issues, having to address, the fact that like now the FBI was going to be under Donald Trump, he decided to withdraw from or suspend SFPD's participation in the JTTF, right? That doesn't mean that like SFPD won't go back one day, right? But that was the resolution that he got to at that point. I think like, some of the challenges, like even though SFPD has withdrawn, right, is we constantly have to monitor what SFP is doing even after the withdrawal, right? So every so often we hear the police chief say like, oh, I wish we were still in the JTTF because then X, Y, and Z wouldn't have happened, right? And so we constantly have to be like, wait, are you trying to like get back into the JTTF? Like try to get that information through PRAs, trying to get that information through like relationships that we've built at City Hall, right? I think the other challenge is that just because the SFPD is actually formally not part of the JTTF does not mean that the SFPD is not working with the FBI and the JTTF on a case-by-case basis, right? But because they're not formally part of the JTTF, they don't have to submit the same sort of annual reports, and so we actually don't know what the current relationship looks like, right? Like, what are these cases that they're working on? What are the demographics of the people that are being targeted? What is the extent of like SFPD's participation in it, right? And so I think like if as and completely as a lawyer, right, and I recognize that I'm not an organizer, I think like what is perhaps like the next step, right, is what Portland did in 2019, which is they withdrew from the JTTF, and because they knew that the Portland Police Department would still be able to continue participating on a case-by-case basis, they passed another ordinance, right, saying that if you do that, you have to report on the number of cases annually. You have to give us the demographics of the people who are investigated or targeted. And there's like a long list of like other factors that like the Portland police has to report on, right? I think what that shows actually is also that this work is really localized, right? It depends on where the community is at, what kind of like city council you have access to, what kind of community partners you have access to, right? To determine like what you can actually do, right? Like, are you going to pass an ordinance, like a transparency and oversight ordinance? Is that what you're able to do in the situation that you're in? And trust me, like that's also not an easy thing to do, right? Like we have we're in talks with like organizations in San Diego who tell us like just trying to pass a transparency ordinance gives them a lot of pushback, right? In California, at the beginning of this year, when we were trying to have conversations around AB 2598, right, which would have required something similar at a statewide level, there was a lot of pushback from like police officers associations and any and all law enforcement agencies that you could think of, right? So what you're able to do, whether it's like a transparency oversight thing, whether it's asking for complete withdrawal, whether it's something else, really just depends on the jurisdiction that you're in. And I think the answer would be highly localized. I want to quickly pivot to doing a brief like KYR. So I think, you know, as we all know that, you know, protesters, activists, just regular community members are being approached by the FBI and the JTTFs. I think there was a question about how to identify whether or not a local police department is part of the JTTF or if it's the JTTF who's coming to talk to you. In most cases, what we have seen is that if it's a local police department working with the JTTF, the local police officer, when they show up, right, if they're not showing up with the FBI already. So one way to identify is if they're showing up with an FBI agent, then you know that they're part of the JTTF, right? So, but if they're showing up alone, a lot of times they will identify themselves as like, oh, I work with the SFPD and I'm here on behalf of like the FBI, right? Or they leave you with a business card that has their name, their department's name, but also says like something along the lines of like JTTF officer. So that's one way of knowing. You can also ask. What I tell clients, what I tell community members all the time is, you do not have to talk to the FBI ever, right? Like if they show up at your work, if they show up at your home, you can tell them that I wish to remain silent. That is my right. They will push back against it a lot. They will tell you that, oh, the fact that you don't want to talk to us makes us feel like you're hiding something. An FBI officer actually said that to me when I called him for my client, like, oh, why is the lawyer getting involved? Like, has your client done something wrong, right? But it doesn't matter what they say, it doesn't matter what the pushback is. If you keep on pushing back, they will eventually leave you alone, right? So tell them you don't want to talk to them, you're asserting your right to remain silent, and you'll have a lawyer contact them. So get their business card and then call a lawyer. In a lot of different cities and states, there's at least one organization, hopefully, that's working on these issues and can represent you. If you're approached by the FBI, if there isn't, you know, Asian Law Caucus isn't like geography bound, and we're happy to help folks or refer folks to like organizations across the country who might be working on these issues. Another thing to remember is don't give out any misleading information, right? Because I think Sue mentioned, if you lie to the FBI, it's considered a federal felony, right? And what we think of lying and what the FBI thinks of as lying are two different things. So we may make innocent mistakes about like, okay, I traveled to Canada on May 1st, when in fact I may have gone, like my flight may have been on May 3rd, right? But if that fact is relevant to whatever they're investigating or whatever they're fishing for, they can come back to you and like charge you with a felony, right? So that's another reason why we say do not talk to the FBI. And if you're arrested, you shouldn't. I know like folks are being arrested, and then we've heard incidents in Oakland, in Sacramento, in New York, in other places. Sorry, I was reading one of the questions, where local police is arresting protesters and then handing them over to the JTTF for questioning. In either of those scenarios, if the police or the FBI give you something to drink, a cigarette to smoke, don't accept any of those things, because then those things can lead to them collecting DNA on you. The last thing I will say about your rights is NLG is a great resource. If you want a more thorough explanation of all your rights, whether you're protesting or whether you want to protect yourself from FBI visits at your home or your office. Another great resource for protecting your tech and your information on different like social media accounts while you're at protest is EFF. And then I'm happy to answer questions. Dirakshan, did you want me to just answer the questions as I see them, or?
Sure. I mean, I think we had a few questions. There is one about the social context. I think someone mentioned about if members of the JTTF or someone comes into your social group, like how do you spot them? Basically, I'm thinking of infiltrators in this context. So if you could maybe answer that, and then there's some others that I would love to answer some of the other folks, ask some of the other folks on the panel.
Sure. I don't think I have a good answer on how do you identify informants. Informants, I think, are hard to identify, and like maybe other folks on the panel also have a better answer. If somebody's showing up not as an informant, but as a police officer to ask you questions, they will identify themselves as either being with some police department or with the FBI.
Awesome. Thank you, Javeria, for that. And I think you mentioned, Javeria, some resources around digital security as well. Could you name them again? I know you mentioned NLG, but there was one more around digital security.
Sorry, the Electronic Frontier Foundation.
Okay, awesome. And folks, we will also send this out. If you did sign up for this particular teach-in, we will send out these resources. One other question that came up earlier that I also wanted to get to was if there was any kind of a documentation or report around college campuses being part of the JTTF, where to find more information?
I can take that one since I'm the person who mentioned that. There is not, as far as I know. I think one of the big difficulties with the Joint Terrorism Task Force is it is really secretive. We don't know who all of the different officers are that participate in it. We often only find out when they question somebody and it becomes clear that they are working as an FBI agent, as Javeria mentioned, if they're showing up with the FBI, if they're, if their like signature or card says Joint Terrorism Task Force. But we are really hoping that in this moment that we can push, city and state elected officials to actually get, more information about who is participating and how much funding they have and all of that, because there is so much secrecy there. And another thing I would add to what Javeria was just saying is it is really hard to identify people who are acting as informants. And so if they're showing up suddenly at your door or at your place of work to like question you, they're often trying to intimidate you too. So they're gonna say that they are, with whatever agency, with FBI, because you will likely think, oh, I have to let them in. You don't have to let them in. Don't even open the door. Don't open the door. Don't open the door. Like if you can, hopefully it's because of COVID, you're not expecting people to show up. So if someone is knocking, look out the window, look out from, you know, the peephole first, like just don't even give them a chance to try to enter, and make sure you get an attorney before talking to them. Like Javaria mentioned, there's Project South, there's MJL Care, there's so many groups that can help with that. And because the community has caught on to informants, right? Like everyone in the Muslim community knows that that's a thing, right? And sometimes it is obvious. That is part of why, you know, a lot of the national security framework has gone more towards like convincing Muslims to police themselves, and using these like extremism, countering violent extremism, Black identity extremism type designations to kind of convince everyone that they should be looking out for, you know, radicalization or radical people. But informants and entrapment definitely still happens, but they're using other methods because, you know, once you catch on, they're going to find another way to do it.
Thank you, Fatma. One of the other questions that came up was if someone has a video of law enforcement following them, the JTTF following them, where would they submit that video?
I don't know that there's a good answer for that one. It could depend upon where you are. What, you know, if you're in a city that, say, has one of these organizations, a National Lawyers Guild, Project South in Atlanta, one of the Asian Law Caucus, Asian Americans Advancing Justice offices, CARE, you can contact them and see if it's something that they could take a look at with you. The fact that somebody from a JTTF is following you is not necessarily a smoking gun of something, but it could be something very important in the context of other things that are going on in the community.
That's helpful, Sue. And I think a connected question is if people wanted to ask a question but don't really feel comfortable posting it online, who should they reach out to?
I'm happy to answer any questions. Direction, if you all want to share my email address with folks, but also I think again, because a lot of this, if it has to do with the personal experience, a lot of this is very sensitive information, and we always recommend, you know, first see if there are organizations locally where you are, right? Because you can pick up the phone, or, you know, I mean, outside of the COVID pandemic context, maybe like meet with the person, with the lawyer or the organizer or the activist in person, and that way keep your information more secure versus emailing it over a server. But yeah, happy to answer any questions that folks have.
Awesome. And then I know Maisha just put in some resources for the media justice page. Do you want to talk about that a little bit, Maisha?
Sure. Yeah, plus one to everything that was just said. Media justice. So after the election, actually, one of the media things that we're the host of a network of several different organizations. And one of the things that happened after the election was people were like, can you help us figure out how do we keep our organizing secure and safe? And truthfully, like our technology inherently is built to track and store information, so forth and so on. But there are practices to keep your organizing more secure, in addition to just coming up with your own safety plans. And so out of that response and out of that request, we were doing digital security trainings. We just had a series called Defend Our Movements. And then I just put in a link to our Defend Our Movements page that goes through a lot of different like one-on-one, like really basic questions, like why should I use Signal? What does encryption really mean? How secure is it? And where else can I go for more information? But I definitely plus one, reaching out to local organizations, because as it was noted, like that's just also much more secure.
Mm-hmm. Awesome. So for folks tuning in, we will definitely send an email out with these resources and also post it on the thread on Facebook. I know some of y'all are asking for email information, so we'll do that. I also want to be respectful of time. Our incredible speakers have stayed a little bit over. And so before I close that, I'd love if I could just have one final word from all of you, because you're all brilliant. These are such tough times. And this was hard to listen to about this really insidious type of apparatus. But yeah, I'd love to just hand it to each one of you if there's any advice, words of just hope and resilience in this moment that y'all want to share. And also we do, as the organizing team, this was part 1 of the teach-in. We do want to come back and do a part 2, which will be more know your rights focused. So folks do stay in tune with what we are going to do. So hopefully this is not the last time we do this convo.
I mean, I guess, can I go? Sorry.
Please.
I was just gonna say that I feel really inspired and hopeful, as tired as I am. I feel really, it's just really incredible to turn on the news and see places like CNN and MSNBC talk about abolishing the police and bring on incredible speakers and to see all of the incredible organizing work. So I think what I'd like to leave with is just keep up the good work, keep organizing, don't let this history and these practices dissuade you. Because first of all, you're not alone. We're all in this together. And we have tools, right? I think one of the things that has really changed in our organizing spaces is that I'm seeing everyday people, photographers, know that they should blur out the faces of protesters that they're taking photos of. It's becoming more normalized. Fortunately and unfortunately, how to protect yourself in this moment. People are paying attention, and so I want folks to know that there is agency even in this moment. And that this work is really incredible, and to keep it up.
Well, I'll just quick hop on after that. I agree 100% with Maisha that that the movement is strong and powerful. We are strong and powerful, and the FBI has a lot of tools, but they have not yet killed a movement, and they will not and cannot kill this movement. And in solidarity, there is strength.
Yeah, just building off of that, they've been trying for 100 years, right? And they didn't stop what's happening right now, right? That they are trying to. They've been trying, and a lot of people ask me, how do you keep going every day knowing all of the things that you know? And it's not easy, right? It's not easy for any of us on this call who hear a lot of the individual cases and know what's happening to folks. But you have to be realistic, because we need to know what we're up against, and you need to be hopeful. And I am hopeful. I'm always hopeful. This teach-in, really revived a lot of my hope, and seeing where we are today is so incredible. They're trying to suppress us because they know how powerful we are, and as much as they are gathering intelligence on us, they're not actually that intelligent, right? They can't actually, not in a rude way, but they actually don't understand how movement and community works, right? And they have not been able to suppress it. So keep building community, keep building power.
Yeah, I just want to echo everything that everybody before me has said. The current moment is very inspiring, and I will also say this: we've started pushing back against the JTTF in Oakland as well, and it's great to see that the FBI is actually scared. From our internal conversations, we can see that they're scared that Oakland will leave, and the impact that's going to have on the rest of the Bay Area, because they've already had like 5 or 6 cities leave, right? Like San Francisco and Portland aren't the only ones. Atlanta just left. The police chief was like, screw this, I'm not gonna be part of it, right? So it's really great to see that sort of fear in an agency that portrays itself as so powerful and is in a lot of ways so powerful, you know? So yeah, I'm really grateful for all the work that's going on right now, and it's very hopeful to see all of that too.
I think everyone said it so beautifully. I remember when I first started organizing, like right after 9/11, it was like Hamid Hayat's case that really pushed me as an undergrad in UC Davis. I'm like, is the FBI really going into the community doing this? I couldn't like wrap my mind around it. And the more I learned about how different communities have been treated, whether Japanese Americans, the Black community, Asian community, it just, I don't think I thought I would see a moment like this, where there's this mass awareness and people were protesting in the streets for days, and there was such a powerful affirmation that there was almost like an investment and commitment that you can read in people's body language and their actions. And I think that'll help push us through what will be a difficult next couple of years. But I think I used to dream of the day where I'm like, if just more people knew what was going on, we could stop this because people are good. And now we're kind of seeing it. So it's a very humbling, and I'm very grateful to kind of witness it.
Amazing. Well, thank you everybody for tuning in. Thank you to our amazing, amazing speakers. Thank you to my co-organizers, Celine and Kafa, who are in the back doing all the tech and looking at all of creating the visuals and all of that. I love y'all. And also, please do remain engaged with us. We're gonna continue to do this. So love to you all. Have a beautiful evening. And yeah, we're gonna win.